Hi everyone, my name's Simon. Welcome to our new rendering teardown section, and today we're gonna go shopping. So, as you can see, rendering is quite interesting. On the overall, the quality is quite good, and as you'll see, there are a couple of things we can make a little bit differently that I think will enhance a little bit the image, but still the overall thing is quite good. So let's start with composition as usually. I don't think there's always much to say, but here you can see I think the focal length is a little bit too low. There's like a little bit of distortion, but still it's not much of a problem, even though I would suggest relying on frontal views because we have really the structure is extremely orthogonal, but still this point of view is quite good. So you can try other things, but still this one is working. I think what we're going to talk about is going to be mainly regarding texture and a little bit of lighting and populating. So texture, the problem we have here is mainly the discrepancy between a couple of textures we have. The main one being here, this guy here. As you can see, there's a problem of say definition. The whole, it's actually, I was a little bit, yeah, as you can see, there's I think there's actually some sort of blur vignetting on the image, which I think is sort of kind of a problem. But as you can see here, basically going back to my texture problem, the texture is not as well defined as the rest of the texture here. And the problem we have, nice detail here, like how it's been mapped properly. The problem here is that, as you can see, the brick texture represents basically half of the space and is like one of the main interesting aspect of the image. So basically, since this is like one of the strong point of the image, you have to be careful on the texture you're using. There is, and especially since there is a bit of bump, I think, but still it doesn't, you see, it doesn't really catch the light, and the shadows are not as interesting as they could be with this sort of material. So you have to play around with the bump map, the roughness, because this is how you're going to get interesting reflection. And also you might have to add a little bit of displacement because it's hard to get like a real effect without having a little bit of displacement. It doesn't have to be that much, but still it's quite it's going to do like quite a bit of a difference. Same things happen with this guy here. The ground is extremely flat, whereas we're having like some sort of tiling, so obviously we should have a little bit more of bump mapping, at least to get the tile bumpiness. And also you might want to add, like we can see here, there's a reflection, but it's completely lost in this area, so you might want to bump it a little bit more. The other thing I'm not really fond of is the two different kinds of wood here, but that's more of a design problem. And here you can see this, like in terms of texture, it really is like, that's the problem, is like in terms of like roughness or yeah, I don't really know what word to use here, but you can see this is some sort of a strong material as well. But here, since the definition is much better, there is like an issue between the two. Like this one is more interesting, but it's sort of like the definition of this one is getting lost against this one. So by having like a proper texture for your bricks, you're gonna have something a little bit more balanced, because here it's sort of catching the eye a little bit too much. Also, I think there's something a little bit weird with the way it reflects, because like it's also lacking. I think there's no bump map on this guy, and it is quite noticeable. So yeah, as I was saying earlier, there's also a problem with this sort of a weird blur here. So be really careful when you're using blur in an image, because it has to, well, there's two problems with that. It has to make sense photographically, and it has to make sense in terms of composition. So basically, blur is only going to happen in terms of like when you have the adequate focal length and when you have different plans, basically. So here, like a vignetting blur is not really, it's not never going to really make sense, especially when you have nothing really sitting right next to the camera, because like even this guy is already like a couple of meters away, so you won't get like a real sense of depth. So that's something you have to be careful with. And even in terms of composition, this is not really adding anything. It's just like, it really just feels a little bit weird because you don't really understand where it comes from. So basically, when you're using blur, really be careful and use it only with like a Z depth pass, so that you make sure that it has a sense in terms of physics, and really use it like when it makes sense in terms of composition. So basically, it will always work better in a close-up. Say you're like sitting here and you're doing like a close-up of this armchair here. What you want to do is, say you have your camera here, you're gonna have this in focus and the rest is blurred out. But once you're sitting too far away from the armchair here, it won't make sense to have this blurred out and this in focus, or the other way around. So that's a little bit the same here. It doesn't really make sense to have just this part of the image in the blurred out, because basically yeah, the distance between this point and us, and the distance between this point and us is different, but the amount of blur is the same, because the vignetting is sort of homogeneous, which is not really physically accurate. Anyway, you get the idea. Another thing I think that could be interesting in this image is to play a little bit more with the scenario and add, well, either remove this guy and add these guys, or anyway. But the thing is, I think it's like when you have an armchair like that, and you can sort of easily imagine people sort of like trying out shoes or whatever, or like a salesman or saleswoman, and someone sitting there. So I guess it could be actually quite fun. And in terms of composition, even, this guy is quite out of the frame, because this is already a really large ratio, and having someone like the only cutout sitting in the image being completely on the far end of the image is a problem. Whereas here you can see, if we sort of use the rule of third, we have like this guy sitting right next on the left third, which is a really good thing. Whoops, don't want to get rid of this guy. So I would try something regarding the sort of storytelling, which I think it would be quite effective here. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is pretty fun. It's something that has been like a trend for a long time, and you can see it in many movies and even architectural visualization. So I'm going to talk about lens flares just a little bit. So here it does make a little bit of sense, and it's just like I'm going to show you how you can use it without looking like I don't know what, but just like overdoing it. So you can see here we have like quite a lot of spots. They're actually quite bright, but they're not that bad. I think that could be fun is to actually, like, there's, say, this guy or this guy, they're sort of looking straight in our face. So basically when you're taking a photo, the lens flare only happens when you have direct light coming right into your lens. So what you could do, and that could be actually quite fun, is to add like a really subtle lens flare here. It could be fun. So also be the opportunity for me to show you how to do it in a non-destructive way. So what you do is you make a copy of the whole thing. So here you can see, whoops, copy. What you do is you go to filter, render, and lens flare. Then you have like a 30, well, it just depends on what type of lens you're using, but it's at least at 35 millimeters because we do have like a bit of a distortion. And then you just change the brightness and you put it right in the middle of your spotlight. Do it. So that looks like this, and then you're like, yeah, that's maybe a little bit not subtle at all. What you can do now is just fill the same layer in black and go to filter and lens flare so that it redo the same thing with your the same option in settings. Then you can set this to screen, and then you have something that does a little bit more sense. The second thing you have to do is blur quite a bit, because you don't want this to be, well, you want it to be subtle, so you can do it that way. And then you just decrease the opacity until you sort of don't see it anymore, because when you're in an interior, it has to be extremely subtle. Even if you're doing an exterior rendering, you don't want to have like this huge lens flare in the face, but still. But the thing is, it's going to add a little bit of a tiny bit of a definition in the foreground, which can be quite interesting in terms of lighting. There was also something regarding the levels. Here you can see when you put in black and white that there's a tiny bit of lack of contrast in some point, so you could increase it just a little bit. But that's mainly it, I think. So that would be something like that. I guess that's it. So yeah, as I said, just mainly like work on the texture. Basically, the idea when you're doing an image is to have some sort of hierarchy in your image and pay attention to what is important in the image and in the project. So basically here, what is important in terms of architecture is the actual material, so you have to pay attention to it. Brick being the major aspect in the image, it has to be like properly mapped and textured, and yeah, displacement and butt and stuff like that have to be used. Then the other thing in mind is going to be basically the composition and the storytelling. But once you get each aspect right for each of these variables, your image is going to be much better. So nothing much to change, but still it's going to be like, it's going to look really good once all these tiny details are taken into account. So yep. Oh, and there was this tiny thing, like speaking of details, that I'm not really fond of. There's something that I see quite often in images, and I'm not really sure why, but it seems like nobody knows how to put a carpet properly. So I'm like, this is not much of a problem, but the problem is when you see this kind of thing here, which is obviously just tiny details, but they're just a little bit problematic. And you can see the same problem happening here. Basically, what I would suggest is when you're putting rugs and stuff like that, just put them properly flat on the surface, because I don't know where this comes from, but I really like the weight of the rug itself make that this sort of thing is sort of impossible to happen. So I'm not really sure why we see this nowadays. Anyway, another detail. So that's pretty much it, or that's actually it. Hopefully you've learned some interesting tips on for your next shopping session, and I'll see you around in the next rendering teardown video. Thank you guys. Bye.
Canada. Hey, Billy. I got a new